Hello and welcome to the Pride and Progress Conversation series over here at LGBTQ Victory Institute. This month, we're really focused on bringing different moments and folks and stories from history to life as we celebrate Pride. And today we're taking a look at a chapter. Some would say it's not over, but we're looking at a particular chapter in queer history dealing with the AIDS crisis and how HIV and AIDS changed our community, catalyzed the formation of our community, and politicized our community. And today, I couldn't think of a better expert than Dr. Ravi Perry. Ravi is the chair of the political science department at Howard University. He is an expert in representation and minority politics, and he's written extensively about Black LGBTQ elected officials, as well as topics related to living with HIV. And so without further ado, welcome, Dr. Perry.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here and for this very important conversation. And happy Pride.
Happy Pride. It is indeed a happy Pride. It seems like we're kind of coming out of a pandemic, but I would like to revisit one that emerged exactly 40 years ago, as we know, HIV and AIDS. It's been exactly 40 years since the CDC released its first reporting about the virus that became known as HIV and AIDS. And so I thought maybe you could help us take a step back in time and kind of go over what was that early time like for people who were in the community.
Well, obviously, I think one of the best words we could use is that it was devastating. It both ravaged lives, broke homes, and forced people to find new ways to build community and to relate to their government. This was a disease, as you reported, that was first referenced by the CDC, what we know of today as HIV, on June 5th of 1981. And while the news, really highlighted that this was kind of like a white gay male disease, there are various kinds of names really until 85 or 86, where we secured kind of the name HIV and AIDS in our lexicon, both in terms of government, but in terms of activists as well. And during that period, this disease was called a whole bunch of things because of the initial perception that somehow it was just some type of a cancer, for example, that gay men could get, and that were getting it in LA and in New York. And of course, that was layered with all kinds of stigma related to just being gay. And this was at a time in the country when it was illegal, still, according to the Supreme Court, to actually have same-sex relations. It wasn't too long after, really just a decade or so, after Stonewall, where it took Black Latina trans activists and allies to finally push back against police, who had been, for not just there, but decades so prior, all around the country and all throughout the 70s as well, raiding bars and clubs where there were relationships between club owners and police, but they stopped giving those club owners the heads up. And so what we began at Stonewall, we began to continue to see, really sadly, even with the advent of Pride, which is why it's in June, just so we all remember that. We are commemorating what happened on June 28th in 1969 in New York, at Stonewall Inn. And so that's why June's become the month that we have. And the HIV epidemic began really about a decade or so after that. So we aren't talking about a lot of time and history that had gone by, and stigma was rampant. And you had a government at the time that had just shifted hands into what we call today Reaganism, was the beginning of a deeply conservative executive branch, which has largely been followed by several other examples of presidencies that have been significantly conservative, and began the shift in Congress, where Congress was in 1981 mostly a Democratic body, and significantly so, in fact, actually. And then a decade or so after HIV was reported, it shifted to be a mostly Republican body for the first time, really, since pre-civil rights era. And so anyway, so that's kind of a little bit of the history that I think is so important to discuss about what was going on in 1981 and why it was devastating. Yes, we had thousands of people's lives that were lost because there was no cure. The government did not know what to do. Doctors did not know what to do initially. And because of stigma, some of the reporting was biased, or you could just say limited, and that it only featured white gay men, when in fact, we began to see after a couple years, Black and Latina women getting diagnosed. And also, of course, from the beginning, there were Black men who presumably are having sex with men who were disproportionately infected as early as 1981, 1982 on record. And so, but we didn't hear those stories. The face of the epidemic was white, gay, and male. And that came with of course, the horrible oppression and stigma of being gay. But it also came with the privilege of being white and of being male. And that was able to be successfully used, I think, by groups like ACT UP, who were originally more homogenous groups that catered to a kind of more narrow gay white community, and then expanded themselves as the epidemic, of course, expanded, because it sadly has always disproportionately ravaged African Americans. And so we can follow HIV to really kind of also follow over the past 40 years how the LGBTQ movement in the United States has grown into new kinds of coalitions that are fighting the legal battles of today.
And let's do that, exactly. You mentioned ACT UP. When was it that, like, how far along in the crisis were we before people started saying, hey, we really have to do something?
Well, activists, of course, were at the beginning of the fight, literally at the beginning in 1981. Organizations didn't really spring up, I would say, in large numbers, particularly those that got media attention, that was able to pressure local government and health departments to do more, really until the mid-'80s. And in social movement theory, that it does sometimes take a couple of years, a couple of summers for movements to develop. A corollary, we might say now, is Black Lives Matter, right? That began in 2012, if people remember, and look where it is today. And I think that's just what happens with movements in general. But once groups were start to organize, there were groups like the Mattachine Society and so many others where folks on a social platform got together, even pre-HIV. But the social activism associated with sexual orientation and gender identity and expression really came about because of HIV and AIDS. And so ACT UP began to really take the mantle, fighting primarily in New York and San Francisco, but of course spread chapters across the country as well over time, that really had a sole mission to pressure government, right, to eradicate HIV, to fund HIV everywhere, and to obviously end the disease. And it took, unfortunately, because of slow federal government response, given the conservative era that we were in at the time, given who the president was, it took several years of activism, largely based in New York City, largely led by groups like ACT UP and others, in order to get some momentum going. And they did some really, aggressive things. They lobbied the mayors, they lobbied the governor, they lobbied the health department. They poured ashes of those lost their lives from AIDS and HIV on the doorstep of the mayor. This was just chronicled, in a season finale of Pose, and so it's really is a unique experience to study HIV in relationship to LGBTQ activism, because really, in some ways, had it not been for HIV, LGBTQ activism in America just may have looked a little bit different.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I often think about HIV and the epidemic in chronological time as following sort of this period of sexual liberation within the gay community and obviously at large in society. And I've always kind of just operated under the assumption that something that the AIDS and the conservative backlash of the 80s were it's perfect timing, right, to just follow this period of liberation.
Well, actually, yeah. In political science, we kind of call that retrenchment or backlash, where after periods of growth, you could argue that the immediate post-civil rights era, you had affirmative action, you had Black people winning major offices like offices of mayor throughout the country for the first time. So you had kind of a period of civil rights victories, followed very swiftly by a decade of conservative, what we may call retrenchment or backlash. We tend to do this in American politics, where that kind of back and forth between not only ideologies, but the power associated with them ebbs and flows. And so you're right. HIV began in a conservative era, and that certainly delayed the lives of many from being saved earlier, and certainly, of course, delayed the advance of government dollars into medical research, so that we didn't get ART drugs until 1996. Perhaps had government responded earlier in the 80s, we might have been able to save thousands of more lives and had come up with that wonderful miracle advancement of ART before 1996. But of course, we were able to get there at least because of the activism that began in the
80s. How did AIDS sort of bring about, I mean, obviously some of the political community formation, it seems out of sheer necessity, but can you talk a little bit about how this pandemic brought the community together on kind of a national and global scale in many ways for the first time, and kind of solidified what we know, kind of the world we're living in now, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So this kind of built the HIV epidemic required a coalition that was diverse in order for it to truly be successful, because it's a virus that does not discriminate, and so activists building coalitions to put pressure on government had to learn not to discriminate as well, and that required kind of rebuilding the same coalitions that were built in the prior generation for the 60s, that began perhaps singularly as a mostly Black kinds of efforts in the 40s and 50s, to very diverse crowds pushing for the same rights by the time we get to the March on Washington in '63 and so many other things in the late 60s. And so a generation later with HIV, yes, it started as a primarily gay white, both in terms of the way it was stigmatized, but also in terms of the way the groups formed. Because frankly, we formed groups based on our social networks. That still is the case today. And if you do not, choose to go outside of your networks to build diverse coalitions, then those coalitions don't happen. And candidates lose, and so many other kinds of issues lose as well. And so what made HIV unique was that because from the beginning, sadly, African Americans were disproportionately impacted by the disease from the very first year of the epidemic, where we started recording infections. And so, Black men were only 7% of the population in the mid 80s and counted for, 25% of the cases. That's, is something that, was disproportionate from the beginning. And we still, 40 years later, don't have an answer to that. But because of that disproportionality, Black folks began to stand up and fight for LGBTQ equality and for HIV and AIDS in ways that you did not see the kinds of sexual liberation as being aggressive parts of the civil rights movement a generation prior. And so you saw a new generation now of folks who weren't baby boomers, but were the children of baby boomers in most instances, who began to create a kind of activism that we would call today intersectionality. And HIV and AIDS arguably was the first child, so to speak, in social movements that benefited from that diversity. It was sadly forced, again, because of a horrible disproportionality in terms of infections among African Americans, particularly Black men that have sex with men. But it did ultimately force groups to organize and to diversify. ACT UP, you began to see much more diverse rallies, for example. When Black literary geniuses who also happen to be gay, passed away, like Joseph Beam, that created and galvanized the Black community again around fighting HIV and AIDS. Obviously, Magic Johnson coming out and it helped people realize that this disease was not limited to someone being gay and was not limited only to sexual, quote unquote, immoral, illicit behavior that a lot of people, stigmatized folks with HIV with in those early days. And then you had people constantly who were who did do the work of merging the the somewhat racialized LGBTQ organizations, where mostly white orgs were not engaging with many of the issues that a lot of Black orgs were doing. But it was people like Melvin Boozer, people like Craig Harris, who were Black, gay, HIV positive activists in the 80s that really were effective, along with folks like Barrett Rustin, and really teetering the line in both kinds of communities, and helped to build a new generation of LGBTQ activists who weren't just gay, white, and male. And that was something that would not have happened if it weren't for the tragedy of HIV being so horribly ravaging the Black community. And unfortunately, 40 years later, those numbers are still the same.
Yeah, that brings up a great point. From you actually just released an article in the Washington Post a couple of days ago here called "What Pride Marchers Won't Be Celebrating: The Politics That Have Left so many Black Americans HIV positive," in honor of Long-Term Survivors Day. In the piece, you point out that Black men accounted for 49% of new HIV diagnoses between 2008 and 2016, despite making up only 7% of the US population. And despite the best efforts of some of the activists we've been talking about, why is this such a persistent problem with Black men in particular, especially as we are celebrating Pride?
And it was just, of course, Father's Day. And so, but you're right. This just was an opportunity that I was given with the Monkey Cage blog. I certainly recommend that people go check that blog out. It's where you have social science experts who are invited to craft pieces on topics that matter. And it's designed differently from an op-ed in that we're supposed to be offering a research-informed analysis on topics for Washington Post readers. And so I do hope that people go check out the Monkey Cage blog. And so, yeah, that was published on June 5th. And as someone who is HIV positive and who is gay, I found the opportunity to write for HIV Long-Term Survivors Day, one I couldn't pass up. And I really appreciate the opportunity to shed light on this disease that sadly is still ravaging Black men that have sex with men. There are a bunch of theories that suggest why that is the case. That Black men that have sex with men are still disproportionately impacted with HIV infections. One theory suggests that it's based on spatial relationships, so where Black men find themselves mostly living, in many instances, in one or two places, in rural communities where there's deep isolation, or in urban communities where there's entrenched structural poverty. And in both cases, you find Black men that have sex with men having difficulty having access to medicine, while also it being much easier for them to contract the virus because of the social arrangements of the areas in which they live, that are, of course, informed by structural arrangements that occur because of political decisions made by our elected representatives. And so Black men that have sex with men end up having disproportionate numbers because they don't have access, for example, to PrEP. They don't live in a community that has an LGBTQ clinic. They don't live in a community where there is, even if you have perhaps HIV, access to, fresh fruits and vegetables to actually, do the best you can with your own care management. So there's a series of compounded problems that lead to Black men that having sex with men and getting HIV. We do know what works, though. What works is education. Works having campaigns that educate people about the U equals U movement is really important. And informing folks about what resources are in their community and that you can get HIV drugs in many instances for free. As someone who's been positive since September 2003, I certainly have seen a lot of doctors' doors. The back of the doors have changed, where the pills have gone from many to take per cocktail to one to take per cocktail, and many options of those. When that suggests progress. John Lewis always talked about progress as it relates to voting rights. We certainly have seen progress as it relates to HIV and AIDS care and management. But you are absolutely right, where we have this huge continuation of the same problem we had 40 years ago is in the Black men who have sex with men community. And I think we can all, roll up our sleeves and help that community by ensuring we are providing educational options. So clubs, bars, restaurants could have leaflets out that give people correct information about how they can best protect their sexual health. But we in the community, can use our own social media channels, our own career networks to try to really spread the correct information. I certainly do that. I hope everyone else does too.
Well, in that spirit, you mentioned U equals U. What can you explain just very quickly what that means?
Yeah, so undetectable equals untransmittable. So this is the idea that if you are on HIV medicine and it's controlled and you've been taking it regularly, the drugs that we have now are so successful that it can essentially eliminate the amount of virus that's in your blood to the point where it's not eligible. It doesn't show up on a lab test, which also means, in effect, that if you are HIV positive and you were to have sex with someone and you were undetectable, that you are not able to transmit the virus to somebody else. That has been a world change. When in 2003, when I was diagnosed, I thought I would never have sex again. I thought no one would ever want to. And then the combination of stigma and access to care, and really in many ways has been significantly made better. Those problems have been made better, have been improved simply because of our medical advances. But it does require us to acknowledge that there is still significant problems in the Black men that have sex with men category. But I want to emphasize as well, 70% of women that have HIV are Black. That's a problem.
Yes. One thing that, as we're kind of closing out here, I wanted to ask is, believe it or not, there is a whole generation of queer kids that are coming of age. Some of them are even voting, who didn't live in this time. They didn't live in the 80s or the 90s. And what would you like them to know about our shared history as it relates to HIV the people who are no longer with us, the people who are with us, and where we're at today. What's your message to the young kids?
Yeah, so I'm a political scientist, and so what political scientists study is the way in which people get things from their government. That's one short definition. And if you are a queer young person, please know that the opportunities of representation that you see on your TV screen, that you see in organizations, that you see in celebrities, see in movies, see in docu-series, etc. All of that has occurred because of the labor of generations before all of us that really fought for our representation, both literal in terms of popular culture, but also literal in terms of being parts of trials for HIV medicine, for example, where we had to decrease the representation there, increase representation there, just to try to make sure that the drugs that were being made, were actually worked on people of color as well. And so it's a long way of saying every time we engage with government, we are forced to do so because of something that we experienced that we felt was wrong. And we've seen this in terms of the Chicano movement, the farmers movement, the women's rights movement, and we certainly have seen it in terms of the LGBTQ movement and the HIV and AIDS movement as well, where when people stood up and petitioned their government for a wrong that they saw, it created a coalition of change that may have taken longer than folks may have liked, may have costed more lives than it should have. But nonetheless, had it not been for those voices that stood up when there were no cameras, when there was no media following them, when the government did not care, and when churches and communities wrote people off literally, and parents and abandoned their children. Sadly, much of that still exists today. And so while we've made progress, we haven't eliminated these stigmatizations. And so we have much more work to do. And it will only happen when young people do it. And so I hope that people are motivated by hearing these stories of folks that have come before each of us that have fought battles in their own communities that allow us to simply walk and lead the lives that we do with the success that we have. We have a long way to go, but we will finish this fight when young people, along with those of us that are a little bit older, continue to join hands and recognize that together we genuinely can end this epidemic and create genuine equality that is embedded throughout all of our government for people who are LGBTQ plus and our allies, but it will only happen if we work together.
Well, Dr. Ravi Perry, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us and talking to us over here at LGBTQ Victory Institute. And happy Pride.
Happy Pride. Love the Institute. Love the work y'all are doing. And your Pride in Progress series, I can't wait to see it go global.
All right. Well, you said it. So there we go.